At the height of the 1890s, on the eastern edge of a small California town called San Jose, a very particular kind of noise had begun to make itself heard, day and night, 7 days a week, across an open orchard of walnut and prune trees. It was the noise of hammers. It was the noise of saws. It was the noise, above all, of a construction site that was, in the strict operational sense, larger than most of the small towns of the Santa Clara Valley, and that had been running, without a substantial interruption, for something like 10 years already. In the middle of the site, visible at first only as a scattering of gables and turrets rising out of the shade of the walnut trees, and later as the site grew, as a whole ridgeline of Queen Anne Victorian architecture receding into its own back lots, stood a house. The house did not, at that moment, have a name. Its owner referred to it, in her correspondence, as La Nada Villa. The construction workers referred to it, when they referred to it at all, as the Winchester place. It would only, in the years after the owner's own death, be given the name by which the rest of the world would come to know it, a name invented, quite deliberately, by the men who bought the property in the summer of 1923 and who understood, correctly, that a tourist attraction sells better if it carries in its very title the promise of something not quite explained. That name is a slight embarrassment to any serious biographer of the person who actually lived in the house. But that name has stuck. This documentary is not about that name. It is about the woman who lived in the house, who never called it a mystery, who spent the last 20 years of her life quietly enlarging it, and who has, in the centuries since her death, been so thoroughly overtaken by the myth of what she supposedly was, a ghost-obsessed spiritualist, a haunted widow, a lunatic building a labyrinth to trap the vengeful spirits of every human being ever killed by a Winchester rifle, that the person she actually was is nearly impossible, on a first approach, to see. Her name was Sarah Lockwood Pardee. She was born in New Haven, Connecticut, on the 4th of June, 1839. She married, in the middle of the American Civil War, one of the sole heirs to the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. She lost her only child at the age of 6 weeks. She lost her husband 16 years later to tuberculosis. She spent the following 40 years of her life in a small stretch of Northern California from which she almost never traveled, endowing in the meantime one of the substantial early tuberculosis hospitals of the American Northeast. She died in 1922, having never in her life met a Boston medium named Adam Coons, for the very good reason that no Boston medium named Adam Coons ever existed. Subscribe for more documentaries on the great dynasties of old money. New episodes every week. One widow, one house, one legend that ate the woman who built the house, and a rifle in the background, whose barrel is present in every version of the story we are about to tell. Sarah Lockwood Pardee, Sally as she was called by her family throughout the whole of her life, and as she signed her personal correspondence for the following 83 years, was born on the 4th of June, 1839, in a rented house at number 29 Orange Street, in the small commercial city of New Haven, Connecticut. She was the 5th child and the 4th daughter of a modest but comfortable New Haven family. Her father, Leonard Pardee, was a carriage manufacturer of Huguenot descent, whose small factory in the industrial district near the New Haven waterfront produced, at its peak in the 1850s, roughly 200 private carriages a year. Her mother, born Sarah Burns, kept the household. There were, in the family, ideas about religion, about the abolition of slavery, about women's education, and about the humane treatment of animals, which were, on the reckoning of the New Haven of that decade, decidedly progressive. The family attended on Sundays the Third Congregational Church, whose pastor, at the time of Sarah's baptism, was one of the leading anti-slavery voices of Southern Connecticut. There were 4 surviving sisters and 1 surviving brother. 2 other children, an older sister and an older brother, had died in infancy of the diseases that had, in the 1830s, taken away roughly 1 American child in every 3 before the age of 5. Sarah was small. She would remain small. She grew, according to the surviving photographs of her adult life, to a height of just under 5 feet, a stature that would in her later years be a subject of a great deal of press curiosity on the incorrect assumption that a small woman was necessarily a fragile one. She was, on the contrary, robust. She rode horses. She played the piano well enough to have been considered, in her 20s, for a small musical career. She spoke, in addition to English, French, German, Italian, and, from a private tutor she took on for 2 years in her mid-teens, a working conversational Spanish. She was, by the standards of a New Haven upper-middle-class household of the 1850s, unusually well-educated. She was admitted at the age of 16 to the Young Ladies Collegiate Institute, which had been established a few years earlier in the shadow of Yale College, and which offered to the daughters of the New Haven professional class a curriculum that was, in most substantive respects, a match for the Yale undergraduate program of the same years. In the small society of New Haven of the 1850s, she was known, in the phrase that would follow her forever afterward, as the Belle of New Haven. It was not a title she seems ever to have particularly welcomed. The photographs show a serious young woman with a very direct gaze, dark hair severely parted in the middle, and no visible interest in the ordinary theatrics of a 19th century courtship. New Haven itself, in the years of Sally Pardee's girlhood, was a city in a certain kind of quiet industrial transformation. It was, on paper, a small East Coast port town of some 20,000 people. In practice, it was already, by the middle of the 1850s, one of the most concentrated centers of small precision manufacturing in the whole of the United States. Its factories produced, along Chapel Street and along the waterfront, the small mechanical goods of a country that was, decade by decade, becoming a full industrial economy. Clock movements, sewing machines, corsets, cotton textiles, and, in a small factory on the north side of the city, cotton and linen shirts. That last factory was owned by a Boston-born businessman named Oliver Fisher Winchester. He had come to New Haven in 1848. He had been by then in the shirt business for the better part of a decade. And he had been quietly for 2 years, taking an interest that his fellow New Haven merchants regarded as unnecessarily speculative, in a small and struggling firearms concern that had been trying to develop, without much commercial success, a new kind of repeating rifle. Oliver Winchester's family lived at number 6 Court Street in New Haven, 4 blocks from the Pardee house on Orange Street. Oliver's only surviving son, William Wirt Winchester, born in Baltimore on the 22nd of June, 1837, and 2 years and 11 days older than Sarah, attended the same New Haven public schools as the Pardee children. Sarah and William, according to what little survives in the family correspondence, knew each other from childhood. There is no record of when exactly they began to see each other differently. There is, however, a record of when they were married. That date was the 30th of September, 1862, a Tuesday afternoon, in the drawing room of the Pardee house on Orange Street, some 6 weeks after the Union Army had been decisively defeated at the Second Battle of Bull Run, and some 8 weeks before Abraham Lincoln, in Washington, would sign the Emancipation Proclamation. Sarah was 23 years old. William was 25. The bride was, by the standards of the New Haven of the following autumn's newspaper coverage, marrying up. The Winchester family had, in the previous few years, begun to be visibly wealthy because the small firearms concern that Oliver Winchester had quietly bought into in the late 1850s was, by the outbreak of the Civil War, in a position to supply, at very substantial volume, the repeating rifle that would, over the following 4 years, transform the tactical arithmetic of the Union infantry. The Henry rifle and its later derivative, the Winchester Model 1866, would end the war on the Union side of the ledger, not because it decided any single battle, but because it demonstrated, decisively, that a single infantryman could now fire in a minute what a soldier armed with a muzzle-loading musket would fire in 10. The country would, over the following 40 years, know that weapon by the name of the man who had marketed it. That name was Winchester. And on the 30th of September, 1862, in a drawing room on Orange Street, Sarah Lockwood Pardee took it as her own. The first year of the marriage was quiet, Because of the wartime shortages of building materials, Sarah and William did not, as they had originally hoped, build a house of their own on Prospect Hill. They lived instead with William's parents at the Winchester family house on Court Street, 4 blocks from the house in which Sarah had grown up. William was, at that time, still formally an executive of the small shirt manufacturing company that Oliver had run since the late 1840s. In 1866, Oliver formally spun off the arms division of his business as the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. William sold his interest in the shirt company and moved across into the arms company as its secretary, and on the strict operational side of the accounts, as its treasurer, the role he would hold uninterruptedly until his death. In the same summer that William took up his new post at the arms company, a daughter was born to Sarah. Her name was Annie Pardee Winchester. She was born on the 15th of June, 1866. She was, according to the surviving records, a small, quiet baby. She was baptized in the family tradition at the Third Congregational Church of New Haven on a Sunday morning 3 weeks after her birth. She lived altogether for 40 days. Marasmus is the name that 19th century pediatricians gave to a form of severe wasting in infants whose bodies could not, for reasons that the pediatricians of the 1860s did not yet understand, absorb the protein of their mother's milk. In modern pediatric medicine, the term covers a family of metabolic conditions of which some are now treatable. In 1866, none were treatable. Annie Pardee Winchester, over the course of her 5th and 6th weeks of life, lost the ability to feed. She lost the ability to be woken. She died at the Court Street house on the 25th of July. Sarah was 27 years old. She did not, in the surviving family record, speak much about it afterward. In one of the very few letters of hers to survive from the following winter, addressed to a cousin in Boston who had also lost an infant that autumn, she wrote a single sentence that has been quoted in the following century and a half by every biographer who has come near her. She wrote that some griefs are not, in the strictly correct usage of the English language, ever finished, that they are only over time absorbed. She did not, according to the surviving evidence of her own correspondence, ever have another child. She and William lived on at the Court Street house. William worked at the Winchester Repeating Arms Company plant 6 days a week. He became, over the following 15 years, one of the most technically competent operational executives in the American firearms industry. He supervised the development of the Winchester Model 1873 SIM, the rifle that would come to be known in the American vernacular as the gun that won the West. He supervised the expansion of the New Haven factory to a workforce, at its peak in the 1870s, of over 1,000 men. He was, in the ordinary business language of the industry, a very competent second-generation heir. He was also, from some time in the middle of the 1870s, seriously ill. He had contracted, at what age is not now recoverable, pulmonary tuberculosis, the wasting bacterial infection that was, in the medicine of the late 19th century, both untreatable and, for a substantial fraction of those who contracted it, ultimately fatal. He concealed the diagnosis from all but his immediate family for a number of years. He worked through it. Sarah, on the surviving reports of those who saw the household in that period, nursed him at home, a role that in the medicine of the 1870s fell almost invariably to the wife, and that required, in the case of pulmonary tuberculosis, an unusual degree of physical proximity to the patient in the closing months of the illness. She did not, herself, ever develop the disease. Oliver Winchester, William's father, died at the family house on Court Street on the 10th of December, 1880. He was 70 years old. He had by then built the Winchester Repeating Arms Company into one of the largest single-product manufacturers in the northeastern United States, and had, in his later years, served a single term as the lieutenant governor of the state of Connecticut. His will divided the controlling stock of the arms company and the very substantial personal residue of his own accumulated wealth among his surviving heirs. The bulk of it went to William. William, on the day he inherited it, was too ill to walk unaided from one room of the Court Street house to another. He lived for 3 months and 3 days more. He died on the 7th of March, 1881. He was 43 years old. He was buried in the Winchester family plot at the Evergreen Cemetery in New Haven, beside the small stone that bore the name of his daughter, Annie. Sarah, on the day of her husband's death, was 41 years old. She was, by any reasonable estimate of what William and Oliver had left her, one of the wealthiest widows in the state of Connecticut, and because she had inherited, in addition to her personal cash bequests, 777 shares of Winchester Repeating Arms Company common stock, in a corporation whose outstanding shares numbered fewer than 1,600 wives, the effective co-owner, with William's sister Hannah and Hannah's husband, of one of the great industrial fortunes of the American arms industry. She was, by the standards of any of the New Haven households she had known in her girlhood, unimaginably wealthy. She was also, in the two most important respects, alone. For the first 3 years after William's death, Sarah remained in New Haven. She lived at first at the Court Street house, whose ownership had passed to her under the terms of William's will. She oversaw from a small office off the Court Street parlor the affairs of her substantial share of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, a role she took considerably more seriously than the ordinary widow of an American industrialist of her generation took the affairs of the corporation she had inherited into. She corresponded at first weekly and then more or less daily with the successor managers at the New Haven factory. She read the balance sheets. She attended, on request, the board meetings for which her presence was required by the company's articles of incorporation. She did not, in any sense that the following generations of her mythologists would come to accept, walk away from the arms business. On the contrary, she remained, until the day of her own death 40 years later, one of its largest single shareholders and one of its most consistently interested private owners. She was, at the same time, extremely unwell. She had begun to suffer in the years of William's decline from a form of joint pain that would in due course be diagnosed as severe rheumatoid arthritis. The condition had progressed steadily. By 1883, she had lost the ability to write for more than about 10 minutes at a stretch without severe pain in her hands. By 1884, she required assistance to descend a full flight of stairs. Her physicians in New Haven, unable to recommend any effective medical treatment for a condition whose pathology would not begin to be understood for another 60 years, recommended what physicians of the Gilded Age recommended, in the absence of any better idea, to almost any wealthy patient with a chronic complaint. They recommended a change of climate. Sarah's mother, Sarah Burns Pardee, died in New Haven in the spring of 1884. She had been ill for many months. Her death removed the last of the immediate reasons for which Sarah had remained in Connecticut. Two of Sarah's 4 surviving sisters had by then already moved to California, one of them, Isabel Merriman, to a house in the small East Bay town of Oakland, from which she corresponded weekly with her sister on the East Coast, and to which she began to write, in the spring of 1884, an increasingly insistent series of letters urging Sarah to consider joining her. The California climate, Isabel wrote, was gentle. The winters, she wrote, were mild. The land was cheap. Sarah, Isabel wrote, could take a year to travel, could visit, could settle, could, at the very least, escape the specific brutality of the New Haven February. Sarah did what a wealthy Victorian widow with substantial arthritis and no remaining domestic obligation in the town of her birth conventionally did in the 1880s. She traveled. She went first to Europe. She spent, according to what can be reconstructed from the surviving hotel receipts among her papers, a substantial part of the autumn of 1884 in Paris, in the winter and following spring in Rome and Florence. She returned briefly to New Haven in the summer of 1885. She left again, later that year, for California. She did not, at the time she left, know with any certainty that she was leaving for good. What she knew, on the ordinary evidence of what she wrote to her sister Isabel in the September of 1885, was that the winter in New Haven was going to be, in the language she used to Isabel, more than she could bear. She arrived in the Santa Clara Valley, some 50 miles south of San Francisco, in the early months of 1886. She was 46 years old. She was accompanied by a small traveling household that included a personal secretary, A maid, and by the summer of that year, her 17-year-old niece, Marion Isabel Merriman, who was Isabel's daughter, and who was called, within the family, Daisy. Daisy Merriman would in time become the closest living relation Sarah would have. She would in due course marry the San Francisco newspaper publisher Frederick Marriott and move a few miles up the peninsula to the town of Atherton. She would remain, in the language of Sarah's own will drawn up nearly 40 years later, Sarah's favorite niece. In the summer of 1886, on the advice of a local Santa Clara Valley real estate agent whose name has not survived, Sarah bought a property on the outskirts of the town of San Jose. It was an 8-room farmhouse, painted white, sitting on approximately 45 acres of walnut and prune orchards. The house had been built in the late 1870s by a local physician named Robert Caldwell for himself and his family. Dr. Caldwell had decided in 1886 to sell up and move nearer to his adult children in San Francisco. Sarah bought the property for approximately $12,500, a sum that represented, on the scale of the fortune she had inherited 5 years earlier, a very small percentage indeed. She renamed the house, in the correspondence she began to send to her New Haven advisors, La Nada Villa, a name derived from the Spanish word for a flat plain, in reference to the level ground on which the house sat. She did not, at any point in the following 36 years of her ownership of the property, call it anything else. What Sarah Winchester did over the 20 years that followed her purchase of Llanada Villa is the fact of her life about which the surrounding mythology has since become densest, and about which the surviving primary documentation is thinnest. The facts, at the level at which they can be reconstructed from her correspondence, from the surviving building account books of the Winchester household, and from the interviews given after her death by the small number of individuals who had worked on the site, an oral history collected in the 1930s by a local historian named Merle Gray, and drawn on extensively by Mary Jo Agnafo in the 2010 biography that has since become the standard scholarly source, are these. She employed at any given time between 1886 and about 1906 between 12 and 22 carpenters. She employed them on ordinary building industry contracts of the period at daily wages that were, according to the surviving accounts, roughly a third above the going rate for a Santa Clara Valley journeyman carpenter of the same years. She provided at her own expense a 2-story dormitory building on the grounds for the workers who preferred to live on site. She did not, contrary to 140 years of popular retelling, employ them 24 hours a day. The work was done in ordinary daylight shifts. It stopped, on evidence from the surviving payroll books, for weeks and sometimes months at a stretch, during Sarah's periods of severe illness, during her occasional travels within California, and during at least one substantial interruption in the autumn of 1895, when the head carpenter of the site was recovering from an accident with a saw. The house grew in a manner that no professional architect would have grown it. Sarah served as her own architect. She had, since her New Haven girlhood, been an amateur student of architectural drawing, a skill she had picked up, according to the surviving family accounts, from a private tutor she had shared with her sisters in the 1850s. She now drew in pencil on ordinary letter paper the additions she wished to see added to Llanada Villa. She handed the drawings to her head carpenter each morning. The carpenter built to the drawings. The results, over the course of 20 years, were what they were. An 8-room farmhouse became a 12-room house. A 12-room house became a 20-room house. A 20-room house became a 50-room house. A 50-room house became a 100-room house. And by 1906, by the count of the surviving newspaper reports of the period, the ridgeline of the roof at Llanada Villa carried at least 7 distinct floors of Queen Anne Victorian gabling, running out across the orchards to the east and the west of the original farmhouse, with something over 160 rooms. Nobody, then or since, has been quite sure of the exact count beneath them. Sarah installed, over the same 20 years, a great many of the small technical innovations of the late Victorian and early Edwardian era of American domestic construction. She installed forced air heating throughout the whole of the growing house, a decade before it was standard in even the largest East Coast mansions. She installed a full electric lighting system in the 1890s, converting from gas piping and retaining both iron, a redundancy she considered simple prudence, on the reasonable ground that the electrical wiring of the 1890s in Northern California could not yet be entirely trusted not to fail. She installed a system of push-button electric annunciators so that a servant in any room of the growing house could be summoned by a single low bell. She installed at least 3 Tiffany art glass windows, of which the most famous is a spider web pattern panel that survives in the house to this day. And she installed, in the additions that were built after about 1900, a series of what she called, in her correspondence, easy riser staircases. Flights of stairs in which each individual step rose no more than about 2 inches and turned at short intervals, so that a woman with severe rheumatoid arthritis could climb from one level of her own house to the next without the sharp knee pain that a conventional Victorian staircase with steps of 6 or 7 inches would have produced. Those staircases, and the very short doorways they connected, and the small tight turns they took at the corners, are the source in the following century of a great many of the ghost and curse stories that the house has come to attract. Some are stairs that end at ceilings. Some are doors that open into blank walls. Some are stairs of 44 small steps that ascend, in total a mere 9 or 10 feet from ground floor to first floor above. None of them, on the sober documentary record recovered by Ignafo, and by the small number of other serious historians who have since worked on the house, has anything to do with spirits. They have to do with a small woman in constant pain, moving through a house of her own design, in a manner that made her daily movement inside it as physically bearable as it could be made. In 1888, 2 years after Sarah's arrival at Lanata Villa, her niece Marion Merriman, Daisy, moved permanently into the house. She was 19. She would remain, in the practical sense of who ran the day-to-day non-carpentry side of the household, Sarah's chief administrative assistant for the following 15 years, corresponding on Sarah's behalf with the Winchester Repeating Arms Company in New Haven, with the family lawyers, with the bankers who managed Sarah's very substantial investment portfolios, and with the various philanthropic and civic bodies to whom Sarah, in these years, was beginning to direct her small but steadily growing charitable giving. Daisy Merriman married the San Francisco newspaper publisher Frederick Marriott in 1903. Sarah bought her, as a wedding gift, a house in Atherton, paid for in $10,000 in gold coin, according to the family history, some 20 miles up the peninsula from Lanata Villa. Sarah's constant companion in the household, for the same 2 decades and afterward, was a woman who has since acquired a small importance of her own in the Winchester bibliography. Her name was Henrietta Severs. She had been hired in New Haven in 1882 as a professional companion, the mid-Victorian equivalent of what a later century would call a private duty nurse, and she had followed Sarah to California in 1886. She would remain with Sarah in continuous employment for nearly 40 years. She would, after Sarah's death, be one of the first people the American press would attempt to interview about her mistress's supposed spiritualist beliefs. Henrietta Severs would, on every one of those occasions, deny, in the flattest possible language, that Sarah Winchester had ever expressed to her, in nearly 40 years of daily proximity, the slightest interest in spiritualist practice. Henrietta Severs, in the flat sentence quoted by the local historian E.T. Rambo in a small newspaper piece printed in San Jose in the 1930s, said only Miss Sally was a private woman. She was not a superstitious one. The hostile press, however, had already begun. By the middle of the 1890s, small local papers in San Jose and in San Francisco had begun to run occasional stories about the strange widow with the endlessly growing house. The stories tended, in a way that a modern reader would recognize from the tabloid instincts of any period, to say considerably more about the taste of the readers than about the character of the subject. Sarah was described variously as a recluse, as a spiritualist, as a woman who consulted a seance chamber every midnight for the following day's building plans, as a woman who had built a room with 13 windows and 13 wardrobes for the specific purpose of confusing the ghosts of the Sioux warriors killed by Winchester rifles in the American West. Ignofo, in the 2010 biography, has documented, source by source, that not one of these stories was corroborated by a single first-person interview with a member of the actual Winchester household during the entirety of Sarah's own lifetime. They were, without exception, the products of press invention. Sarah, who read the local papers, was aware of the stories. She did not attempt to correct them. She was, on the ordinary evidence of her surviving correspondence with her New Haven friends, mildly irritated by them, and, on at least one occasion in the winter of 1897, sufficiently annoyed by a particularly inaccurate San Francisco Examiner piece to have her lawyer, Roy Lieb, write a formal letter of correction. The paper did not print the correction. The story ran on. The mythology from that year onward would run on more or less independently of the person around whom it was accumulating. On the morning of the 18th of April, 1906, at 12 minutes past 5, the San Andreas Falls slipped along a stretch of some 290 miles from the Mendocino Triple Junction in far northern California down to the small town of San Juan Bautista, about 30 miles south of San Jose. The earthquake that followed on the modern seismological scale is now estimated to have been a magnitude of 7.9. It was until the Loma Prieta earthquake of 1989, the largest earthquake ever recorded on the Northern California section of the fault. It killed, over the following 72 hours, mostly through the fires that broke out in the shattered gas mains of San Francisco, an estimated 3,000 people. It displaced, over the following 2 weeks, more than 200,000. Sarah Winchester, on the morning of the 18th of April, was asleep in a small bedroom on the second floor of Lanada Villa. The room had been decorated in a pattern of daisies, the flower after which her niece Daisy Merriman had been nicknamed, and it was known in the household as the Daisy bedroom. The shaking of the earthquake, according to the account Sarah gave several days later to a physician who visited her at Lanada Villa, threw her from the bed onto the floor. It jammed the bedroom door, which had shifted at its top hinge at the moment of the first shake, and would not, thereafter, open. She was in the room alone and unable to leave for the better part of the following hour. When one of her carpenters at last arrived at the door with a small crowbar he had had to obtain from the tool shed at the back of the property and forced the door open, Sarah, who had by then dressed herself with considerable difficulty in the ordinary clothes she wore for a working day, walked out onto the landing without any visible sign of distress and asked, according to the carpenter's later recollection, only whether there had been any injuries among the workmen on the site. There had not been. 2 of the carpenters had been slightly cut by falling debris in the front hall. None had been more seriously hurt. The 7-story tower at the northeast corner of the house, the tallest structure Sarah had ever added to Lanada Villa, completed only 3 years earlier, and containing at its top a small observatory-style room from which, on a clear day, one could see the peaks of the Diablo Range to the east, had collapsed entirely during the shaking. The upper 2 floors of the north wing had shifted several inches on their foundations. 3 of the interior chimneys had cracked, and the tallest of them had fallen through the roof of the west parlor. Sarah's response to the damage was, on the evidence of what she then did over the following 2 weeks, the exact opposite of what her later mythologists have almost universally attributed to her. She did not attempt to rebuild what had fallen. She did not, in the language of her later cultural caricature, understand the earthquake as a message from the spirits that certain rooms of Lanada Villa had become inauspicious. She did not, in the strictest sense, understand the earthquake as a message from anything at all. It was a natural event of a kind she had, since her arrival in California 20 years earlier, been told to expect. What she did, quite systematically, over the course of the fortnight following the shake, was to have the damaged rooms sealed off. Doorways were bricked up. Small hallways were fitted with new interior walls, closing off the passages to the collapsed sections. Stairs that had led, until the morning of the 18th of April, up to the vanished 7th floor of the tower, now led, quite simply, to a fresh wall of new plaster where the tower had once been. Sarah had, in short, walled off the parts of her own house that had, in the earthquake, become unsafe. Those doors that opened onto walls and those stairs that ended at ceilings are what a great many later tourists would come to Lanata Villa specifically to see. Those doors and those stairs are, on the sober record, the direct consequence of a very ordinary structural decision made by a widow of 66 who had been advised by the local engineers who had come to inspect the property in the fortnight after the shake that the safest course was to seal the damage and to build no more to the east of it. Sarah moved, later in 1906, to the house in Atherton that she had bought 3 years earlier as a wedding gift for Daisy Merriman and Frederick Marriott. She kept Lanata Villa. She continued to add smaller additions to the west wing of Lanata Villa over the following 15 years. But she never, after the earthquake, slept regularly in the main house again. She spent, from 1906 onward, the greater part of her time at the Atherton house, in the company of Daisy Marriott and Daisy's growing family. In the same period, and quite deliberately, Sarah began to organize, at last, the philanthropic legacy that she had been putting off for the better part of a quarter of a century. On the 16th of November, 1909, she wrote to the General Hospital Society of Connecticut in New Haven, the parent body of the small New Haven hospital that had, in the early 1880s, cared for her dying husband, with a specific proposal. She would fund, at her own expense, the construction and endowment of a new tuberculosis hospital to be built on hospital grounds in New Haven, to be dedicated to the memory of William Wirt Winchester, and to be devoted exclusively and in perpetuity to the treatment of the disease that had killed him. She sent within the same month a first check for $300,000. She would, over the following decade, add substantially to the endowment. The William Wirt Winchester Memorial Hospital opened its doors in New Haven in 1918. Its total endowment from Sarah Winchester, by the time of her death 4 years later, was in the region of $1.33 million, the largest single philanthropic transfer she ever made, and one that, on almost any measure of contemporary purchasing power, was one of the substantial individual medical endowments of the American Progressive era. The hospital treated tuberculosis patients from the New Haven area and later from across the state of Connecticut for the following 50 years. It was in due course absorbed in the second half of the 20th century into what is now the Yale New Haven Hospital System. It exists today on the same site as the Winchester Center for Lung Disease. It has, on any reasonable estimate, treated over its now more than a century of operation in the region of 100,000 patients. That fact, in the century since Sarah's death, has almost never been mentioned in the tourist literature of Lanata Villa. Sarah Lockwood Pardee Winchester died at the Atherton House on the 5th of September, 1922. She was 83 years old. The cause of death, as certified by her Atherton physician, was congestive heart failure. She had been declining in the general sense that a woman of 83 with a lifetime of severe rheumatoid arthritis and a substantial cardiac history was in 1922 obviously going to be declining for approximately the previous 2 years. Her last coherent conversation, according to Daisy Marriott's account written the following week, had been with Daisy herself on the evening of the 4th of September on the subject of the household's usual arrangements for the winter migration of songbirds to the Atherton garden. Her will, drawn up over the course of the previous 15 years and revised several times, was, in accordance with her ordinary sense of legal precision, 12 pages long and organized into 13 numbered clauses. It has been reported in the following century that she signed it 13 times, and that this fact was somehow evidence of her superstitious attachment to the number 13. The truth is only that a well-drafted American will of the 1920s routinely required the testator to initial each individual page. One signature per page plus a final signature. Sarah's will, at 12 pages plus a final signature, required 13. There is no evidence in her surviving correspondence that she attached any particular weight, superstitious or otherwise, to the number. The will divided the residue of her personal fortune, which, after the funding of the William Wirt Winchester Memorial Hospital and various smaller charitable bequests, still exceeded $4 million. Among her surviving family, her long-serving staff, and a small number of civic bodies in California. Her favorite niece, Marion Marriott, received the bulk of the personal estate, subject to a life interest arrangement under which the income of a substantial trust was paid to Marion during Marion's lifetime, with the principal to pass, on Marion's death, to the New Haven Hospital. Henrietta Severs received an annuity that would provide for her comfortably for the remaining 26 years of her life. The head carpenter of the Wienata Villa site received a small but respectable retirement provision. Roy Lieb, the San Jose attorney who had served Sarah as her general counsel since the early 1900s, was named executor of the estate. He would in due course wind it up with the same discretion and competence with which he had, for 22 years, run its ongoing legal affairs. Sarah was buried at first at the Alta Mesa Memorial Park Cemetery in Palo Alto, a temporary interment that her family had agreed on some years earlier, at Daisy's suggestion, on the grounds that it was closer to Atherton and that no immediate long-distance transport would be required. Some years afterwards, in accordance with what Sarah had actually written in the will, her remains were transferred to the Winchester family plot at Evergreen Cemetery in New Haven, and were placed beside those of William and of Annie, who had been buried there in 1881 and in 1866 respectively. The house in San Jose was sold. It sold in the summer of 1923, the first summer after Sarah's death, for $135,000 to a group of local Santa Clara Valley investors who had incorporated themselves for the purpose as the Winchester Investment Company. Their intention, as reported in the local press that autumn, was to open the property to the public as a paid attraction. They had, quite correctly, understood that the local rumors about Sarah's supposed spiritualist practices, rumors that Ignafo would in due course trace back, source by source, to the specifically pre-1922 hostile press coverage, could, if properly marketed, be turned into a very substantial source of paid admissions. They gave the property the name that Sarah herself had never used and would, on any evidence of her actual disposition toward it, have thoroughly disliked. They called it the Winchester Mystery House. The house opened to the public in the winter of 1923. It has been open continuously ever since. It receives, in a good year, well over 400,000 paid visitors, a figure that puts it in the modern tourism economy of the Santa Clara Valley, alongside the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, and slightly ahead of the historic homes of Silicon Valley's tech founders. The mythology, meanwhile, has grown. The founding text of the Ghost and Curse version of the story that most present-day American visitors will hear on the tour, that Sarah Winchester, in the year after her husband's death in 1881, traveled from New Haven to Boston to consult a spiritualist medium named Adam Coons, and that Adam Coons told her that the vengeful ghosts of every person ever killed by a Winchester rifle would follow her for the rest of her life unless she built a house for them to live in, and that she must never, on pain of her own death, cease construction on that house, is a book called Prominent American Ghosts. It was published in 1967, 45 years after Sarah's own death, by a psychic researcher and author named Susie Smith. There is no evidence in any of the surviving Winchester family papers, or in any of the New Haven spiritualist directories of the 1880s, or in any of the Boston city directories of the same decade, that a Boston medium named Adam Coons ever existed. The character appears to have been invented, in whole cloth, by Smith. He has been elaborated on, in the intervening 60 years, by a great many popular ghost tour writers, a horror film released by CBS Films in 2018, and starring the British actress Helen Mirren in the title role, and because ghost stories will always find an audience that wants to hear them, by a substantial fraction of the tour guides at the house itself. The corrective biography, when it appeared very late. Mary Jo Ignafo's Captive of the Labyrinth, Sarah L. Winchester, Heiress to the Rifle Fortune, was published by the University of Missouri Press in 2010, 88 years after Sarah's own death. Ignafo had spent, by the time of the book's publication, the better part of 15 years working through the surviving Winchester family papers, the Los Altos History Museum archives, the New Haven Historical Society archives, the surviving correspondence of Daisy Marriott, the surviving correspondence of Henrietta Severs, and one archival source at a time, every one of the primary documentary sources on which the Adam Coons legend and its many companion myths had, over the previous century, purported to rely. She found in that time not one document that supported the legend. She found, on the contrary, a great deal of documentary evidence: private letters, hospital account books, share register entries, philanthropic pledges, medical bills, and most damning of all, the flat contemporary denials of the household staff, i.e., that painted of Sarah Winchester a rather different picture. It was the picture of a small, private, unusually intelligent widow in constant physical pain, who had inherited a considerable share of an American arms fortune, who had never emotionally recovered from the deaths of her daughter and her husband, who had spent 40 years quietly building and rebuilding an eccentric California house, because building was, for her, an intellectual and physical occupation that filled the days, and who had, in the last decade of her life, put a very substantial fraction of her remaining fortune into a New Haven hospital that has since been treating lung disease for over 100 years. The mythology, unfortunately for Sarah, has continued to sell tickets. The corrective biography, in the 15 years since its publication, has continued to be read in the ordinary way of a serious university press biography by a considerably smaller audience. Return for a moment to the sound with which we began, to the noise of hammers, of saws, of a construction site running through a summer afternoon in the walnut orchard south of San Jose. The woman who ran that construction site was not, on any of the surviving evidence, a person who was building for spirits. She was not a person who believed she could not stop. She was not a person who believed the house would kill her if it were completed. She was a person who was, quite simply, in an ordinary and human way, trying to fill a set of decades that had begun with two very specific catastrophes: the death of an infant daughter in 1866 and the death of a husband in 1881. And that could not, on any of the emotional resources available to her, be filled by anything else in particular. She built, in short, because building was the only ordinary activity she found herself able to do with the very substantial money that a very substantial industrial fortune had given her. That she also gave away a fraction of that fortune to the largest single American tuberculosis hospital of the first quarter of the 20th century, and that the hospital exists today, in the same building, treating the same disease under a new name, with 100 years of continuous patient records to its credit, is a fact that is not disputed by any serious historian. It is a fact that is, however, almost never mentioned by the tour guides at the house she left behind in San Jose. The house sells tickets, the hospital does not. In the Evergreen Cemetery in New Haven, Connecticut, there is a small stone monument of no particular architectural distinction on which three names are carved. The first name is that of William Wirt Winchester, and the dates beside it are 1837 and 1881. The second name is that of Annie Party Winchester, and the dates beside it are 1866 and 1866. The third name is that of Sarah Lockwood Winchester, and the dates beside it are 1839 and 1922. The three names are set out in the order of death, not the order of birth. That order is, quite deliberately, the order in which the small family fell. Some houses, in the end, are built not to contain their owners, but to occupy them, and are then, at the owner's death, misunderstood by every subsequent generation as monuments to a haunting that never took place.